How do we think? How does thinking develop in young people? How does it dissolve or dissolute in older age? They're also messy, but as a scientist, just because something is messy or difficult doesn't mean it's not worth tackling. You can always make some sort of headway of understanding just a little bit more about it.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Together, we can make a better future. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm interviewing a neuroscientist and a writer who has done a lot of work on the topic of synesthesia, or the melding of sense perceptions, where you can taste sounds or hear flavors or stuff like that. His most recent book delves into how we can take back control of our attention from addictive social media. This should be of interest to most of us, especially parents of young children, teenagers who don't know what to do to help their kids put down the devices and engage with life. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. Please come visit me on my Facebook group, The Rational View, and give me your opinion and feedback. I'd love to hear from you. Dr. Richard Cytowic, a pioneering researcher in synesthesia, is Professor of Neurology at George Washington University. He is the author of Synesthesia, The Man Who Tasted Shapes, The Neurological Side of Neuropsychology, and with David Eagleman, the Montaigne Medal winner, Wednesday Is Indigo Blue, Discovering the Brain of Synesthesia. His newest book is entitled Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age, Coping with Digital Distraction and Sensory Overload. Dr. Cytowic, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks for having me.
Your bio is very interesting. Could you tell us a bit about your background and why you decided to become a neuroscientist?
Oh, by accident, really. Because in medical school, I hated the neuroscience courses. We would make diagrams of the neuroanatomy with colored pencils. And then the next day, the professor would come in with all the exceptions as why they were wrong. We had to redraw all them and all that. And finally, just before a big exam, in came this lecturer that we had never heard of before, who was going to talk about the limbic system, or the emotional brain. And she gave us a 28-page handout of, quote, a few of the salient points of it. Well, it was like we were all up in arms. And I went home and I just said, I was just livid. And I threw my notes off my apartment balcony. Now, obviously, I retrieved them. But what changed is that when I was rotating through neurology as a student, I was reading this big fat Principles of Internal Medicine in the section on neurology written by Ray Adams from Harvard. And, this laundry list of unpronounceable diseases that didn't have any cure. And then I came across aphasia, which is a loss of language. And I thought, oh my God, how diabolical. You can move your lips and tongues and make sounds, but you can't either speak or you can't understand what people are saying to you. Wow. And I laughed out loud. This is like at 1 a.m. in the morning. And I thought, oh shit, I'm supposed to hate this stuff. So that's when neurology picked me. And then on the wards, there was a particular Dr. William McKinney, who one afternoon put his arm around me and said, Rick, you've got a real knack for this. We ought to send you off to Queen's Square, which is the name of which is the place in London, the center of English-speaking neurology. And so off to Queen's Square I went, and there I learned, I guess, about the more theatrical aspects of neurology. But I was always interested in what are called higher cortical functions. So when, for example, the music critic for the New York Times, Harold Schoenberg, wrote a front page piece about the anniversary of Maurice Ravel's death, and said something about that when he was swimming and at the seaside, and all of a sudden he couldn't coordinate his movements, and after that he was unable to speak or compose. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I went to the library and I found everything I could about Ravel. And I ended up writing a paper that was another award winner about aphasia in Maurice Ravel. And it turned out that there's your musical system, which is similar to language, is separate from language. So Ravel could criticize and point out errors and all that, but he couldn't compose the music that was locked in his head. Well, the fact that I was interested in aphasia got me labeled philosophically minded, because back in the 70s, neurology could care less about higher brain functions. Alzheimer's disease, forget it. Nobody had any interest whatsoever in that. And I know this sounds really strange because now it's such a central point of interest. But in 1973, 77, nobody cared about it. It was stroke. I trained in stroke with a person who was famous in stroke medicine. So it was stroke, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, peripheral neuropathy, and it was all physical body stuff. Nobody was interested in the mind. And that's what interested me most about neurology is like, how do we think? How does thinking develop in young people? How does it dissolve or dissolute in older age?
Right. These are the harder problems, I think, and maybe why they weren't attracted.
Well, they're also messy, but as a scientist, just because something is messy or difficult doesn't mean it's not worth tackling. You can always make some sort of headway of understanding just a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's these kind of incremental wins that eventually take the day.
I'm very interested in mind and consciousness and awareness and all of these things, and some of the insights you get from when things go wrong are quite intriguing. So you are a pioneering researcher in synesthesia. Could you just for all of us give us a nice definition of what is synesthesia?
Well, everybody knows the word anesthesia, which means no sensation. The dentist gives you Novocaine, you can't feel anything. So synesthesia means joined or coupled sensation. So there are children who are born with 2, 3, or all 5 of their senses hooked together, so that my voice, for example, is not only something that they hear, but they might also see it or taste it or feel it as a physical touch. Often they're shocked to discover that not everybody does this. I mean, one woman as a 7-year-old told her best friend that the letter A was the most beautiful pink she'd ever seen. What does your A look like? And the friend looked at her and said, "You're weird." So, and she never spoke to her again. So either they go think, well, everybody does this, or I'm the only one on earth that does this. And so there's a great feeling of alienation that can happen. I mean, I've had grown men cry on the phone to me. These are people with PhDs saying that nobody ever believed me, and or you're the first person who's understood what I'm experiencing. So as a physician and also as a writer, it doesn't get any better than people who say, "You saved my life." I heard you on the radio, because in the early years, my secretaries would just laugh at the mail that came in. People were sending me drawings and all sorts of stuff. And I remember one woman, and she was a college teacher in Florida, and she said, "I saw your article in Psychology Today, and I ran to my husband waving the magazine saying, 'Look, this is me. I'm not nuts.'" So, and this is what's happened to for the first 15 years. I mean, I did this back in 1980. my colleagues, I told them about Michael Watson, the man who tasted shapes. Michael said he taught lighting design at the School of the Arts. He invited me to dinner to meet some of his friends, and then said, "Oh, will be a few more minutes. There aren't enough points on the chicken." So his friends laughed and said, "Oh, Michael, what are you smoking now?" And Michael turned to me, beet red, like he had just blurted out something terrible, and said, "Well, you're a neurologist. Maybe you'll understand. When I taste something, I feel it on my face and in my hands. A feeling sweeps down my arm as if I'm actually grasping something, weight, shape, temperature, texture." And I said, "Oh, you have synesthesia." I was just trying to be polite.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me and said, "You mean there's a name for what I do?" And that's when the light bulb went off. And I thought, how could he not know? And I thought, this is something that's really quite interesting, could be quite interesting. Nature always reveals herself through her exceptions. And this sure was an exception when people say, I see music, I taste shapes, etc. So I told my colleagues about this, and they said, "What's his CAT scan show?" And I said, no, you don't understand. He doesn't have a hole in his head. He has something extra. And they looked at me like I was crazy and said, "Oh, man, you stay away from this. This is too weird, too new age. It's going to ruin your career." Well, it didn't. But I put up with 15 years of people saying, "No, this cannot possibly be a real phenomenon. They're just looking for attention. They're making it up. They're having residual hallucinations from years of smoking pot or LSD." And then it went on. Basically, this is typical of orthodoxy, which is to deny or explain away what it either can't or doesn't wish to understand. So they came up with one excuse after another, and then demanded pictures of the brain, basically scans. Well, when they finally got the pictures of the brain, they had to shut up because there was the proof that they were asking for, that in fact this is real. And so fast forward, now synesthesia is very, very popular. I'm happy to say that back in the early 80s, I would get letters from graduate students who said, "Oh, I would love to do my thesis about this, but my chairman would never let me. He kicked me out of the program." And now young people all over the world have been writing papers and monographs and doing research, and there's conferences, etc. It's quite exciting, and it's also gratifying to see how young people have taken up the cause.
So what have we learned? What insights have you gained into how minds work while researching synesthesia? Like this is tied into the philosophical concept of qualia and how we experience the world. What does the existence of synesthesia, how does it happen? What do we know?
Well, in terms of qualia, it sort of refutes a number of theories about in qualia is like, so there's the qual of something is red, so the redness is a certain qualia, for example. So I put something, and then there's the binding problem. So I put something yellow and sweet and viscous on my toast rather than saying it's honey. So how do all these different aspects of sensation, which arrive at the brain, the thalamus, the central station, at different time scales, and so how are all these put together? So synesthesia has basically forced us to rethink how the brain is organized. When I was doing training, modularity was the reigning paradigm. Jerry Fodor from Rutgers University. There was this speech, there was the language module, there was a mathematical module, there was a this, that, and the other module. And by definition, there was no connection among them. Well, synesthesia sort of blows that idea apart, because instead of having 5 separate channels from the outside world to the inside, there's our senses are really quite coupled already. And most people don't stop to think this, but the question isn't, do synesthetes have crosstalk in their brain? Of course they do. The question is, how much crosstalk is there and how much is there in otherwise normal people? And it turns out there's an awful lot. For example, sight and sound are so tightly bound already that even a bad ventriloquist convinces us that the dummy is talking. Or in cinema, we're convinced that the dialogue is coming from the mouths on the screens, not the speakers that are surrounding us. Dance is another example of how sound and rhythm and body movement are bound together. We're compelled to move to the beat of the music. So yeah, we're all synesthetic. It's just that we're not consciously aware that we are. Whereas in synesthetes, they are aware of these cross connections.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting stuff.
There's also examples of sensory substitution. For example, the tongue is a marvelous brain-machine interface. Paul Baccarita developed a thing called the brain port, and it's a little electrode array that you stick in your mouth. And so you're feeling this buzzing on your tongue, which is connected to a camera. And all of a sudden this helps people with vestibular disorders. You can see things, you can do all sorts of things with this. He said that, the impulses coming from your big toe to your vision there's no difference between them. You just put the input in and the brain figures it out. So Eric Weimaraner, who was congenitally blind, scaled Mount Everest using the brain port. And he also developed a kind of echolocation on his own where he clicks
this tongue. Is actually using your tongue as an image sensor?
As an image sensor, yes.
Wow.
You just put it's commercially available. It's expensive, but it's fantastic. Is that you put the input in and the brain just figures out what's going on. You have a camera and a coupling device to this electrode array, and the brain knows what to do with that input.
So you can reroute the sensations on your tongue to the visual cortex.
You can, exactly.
Oh my goodness!
It's called sensory substitution, and it's not the only example of sensory substitution, but that's another big field. So,
wow.
Well, we have to get to our Stone Age brain and all this technology.
Your new book is entitled "Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age: Coping with Digital Distraction and Sensory Overload." So what inspired you to go out on this limb and write about this topic?
Oh, my own frustration about 5 years ago of like how annoying the phone was. For many years, my husband and I we just had track phones for the occasional outgoing call, because like, who was going to call us? We don't need to call anybody. And we were in New York and trying to find an address. Now, this is a city that's built on a grid, for God's sake, so you would think it'd be easy to find an address, but we couldn't. And by that point, all the public pay phones had been ripped out, so there were no phone books to look at anything. So we just, in exasperation, we just looked at each other and said, we have got to get an iPhone, if only for the maps. So we got iPhones, and we initially toying with it for the first couple of days, and I said, oh my God, now I see why this stuff is so addictive. It's like having a slot machine. The paradigm here is all positive intermittent reinforcement, which means, Pavlov's dog, you give it some meat and you ring a bell, and eventually when you just ring the bell, it salivates without having any meat in view. That's classical reinforcement. Right. Intermittent reinforcement is when the rewards come unpredictably, just as they do in a slot machine. So you're feeding a slot machine, you get a little hit, you play some more, you get a bigger hit, and eventually you might win the jackpot. But it keeps you occupied in feeding the beast. And this is what the infinite scroll on the phone does. There's no end to that scrolling. Whether you're scrolling up and down or left or right, it just keeps going. And so you can, if you're on TikTok or Instagram, you can just you can easily lose an hour doing this and then realize, oh my God, look at all the time I've spent doing this. And what for? What did it gain me? Nothing. So that was sort of the impulse, and I started looking into the science behind digital distractions.
Okay. So you've written this book. You, as you say, got these phones and became addicted. Like, were you able to use your knowledge of the brain to disconnect, or did you go through an addiction phase?
Well, no, I mean, the insight there was that, my God, no wonder why these people say they're addicted to their phones. And so at the beginning, the thing was to turn it off, and because I wasn't using it all the time. I'm retired, so I don't need to be in contact with everybody all the time. And besides, I'm well enough known that anybody can find me all over the world. So I'm very reachable. I think I didn't become addicted to it, although it was quite easy to see how. And so that led me to look into, or why are people so addicted to it? Why is it so easy? Well, for one thing, tech companies hire armies of psychologists and people who are engaged in gamification, that is, making game-like rewards and point scoring and things, that they are interested in keeping your eyeballs glued to their apps as long as possible. They know that there are only 1,440 minutes in a day, and they fight ruthlessly for your eyeballs. So these tech companies are much better at distracting us than our poor biological brains are at defending ourselves against them. So step one is to recognize what you're up against. You got to take a defensive posture, and say, "Whoa, I have to push back against this." I mean, I'm not a Luddite by any means. I mean, the iPhone is simply incredible. I mean, it's better than Star Trek, and it's 10,000 times more powerful than what the Apollo computers had. And it's a godsend. It's great, but at the same time, it's a narcotizing agent. And so you have to know when to put it down and put it aside and say no to it and go outside for a walk.
You claim that tech companies create the illusion that we're in control of our own brains. What do you mean we aren't in control? Isn't this just like willpower or lack thereof?
Well, that's one argument. I can stop any time, except they don't. And this is what any addicts, whether it's alcohol, cocaine, or other drugs, I can stop any time. But you say, okay, well, give it a week, give it a month, and then let's see what happens. And when they realize that they can't stop, hopefully the insight goes on that, in fact, you are addicted to this. So to teenagers who say, I'm addicted to my phone, I say, turn it off. Turn off your laptop in your bedroom. Turn everything off, and see how you fare. And they can't do cold turkey like that. And companies know this. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg knew that his Instagram and Facebook was damaging to young girls' self-esteem and cutting and bulimia, etc. And did he care? No, he didn't care. They just kept at it because he was raking in billions of dollars. And all the companies are like this. They do not care morally or ethically about what they're doing to people's brains. I have had correspondence with some fathers who were involved, like the guy who invented the like button, for example. He rused the day that he ever did that. He said it was one of the worst decisions in his life. Wow. Others said, I never realized what we were doing to kids' brains until I saw what it was doing to my son. So there's the incredible hypocrisy in Silicon Valley of the parents there who invent all this stuff, forbidding their children to have any access to this, to the point that they make their nannies sign non-disclosure agreements that they will not use their own iPhones or allow anything in the presence of their kids. So what do they know that they're not sharing with the rest of the world? I think that's just really evil. Mark Zuckerberg said about don't be evil. He is evil. He's the epitome of evil.
What are like some of the ramifications of too much screen time that might not be so obvious to people? Are there things
Well,
that these people know?
one that's gotten a lot of attention when I write about this is virtual autism. Now, when I say virtual autism, the first thing that happens, because people don't pay attention, they don't listen, right away they think, oh, my child, the screens are going to make my child autistic. Well, no, they're not. What heavy screen exposure does, and this was shown in a large cohort of Romanian orphans, is with increasing screen time, you get autistic-like symptoms. So lack of eye contact, they don't answer to their name. You get a grunt, if anything, as a response. Failure to socialize, inability to socialize, inability to have any kind of human interaction. And if you take the screen away or severely reduce its exposure, then these symptoms revert. And that's been shown, all over the world, really, but also in places here in the United States, like Hillary Cash's Restart thing, where people send their kids here for basically kind of a boot camp where they take screens away.
Wow.
One of the best things is the Waldorf schools. The philosophy of the Waldorf schools is that kids, you interact with one another, you do hands-on work like knitting and felt work and puzzles and constructing things, and there are no smartphones until I think about age 11. And the hardest thing is to get the parents to agree to this. The kids love it because they're not constantly disrupted by this stuff. And they turn out to be pretty smart people. And guess where one of the most popular Waldorf schools is? It's the Waldorf School of the Peninsula in the high-tech center of California.
Interesting.
That's where all these people send their kids.
You say that screens are the new secondhand smoke. Can you talk a bit about that idea? How are screens like secondhand smoke?
Well, okay, secondhand smoke, we inhale it through our lungs and has negative effects on us, and so other people are really impinging on our rights as to not be bothered by this. It was a professor initially was laissez-faire about screens in his classroom, and then he noticed how distracted everybody was, and so he demanded that lids down on your laptops. And so the idea is that as long as you're in the line of sight of a screen, it cannot help but distract you. And I think everybody has experienced this in a doctor's order or doctor's office or a waiting room or an airport lounge. You've got all these big screens and they're broadcasting the news or whatever they're tuned into. And you've got that scroll on the bottom that's dishing out the latest breaking news as if we really need to know about this. And you can't help, they demand to be looked at. You almost cannot help but look at them. The only way that I cannot look at them in an airport, for example, is if I bring along earplugs and put earplugs in my ears and look at my own work. But the flickering in your peripheral vision triggers a very ancient response in us, what's called the orienting response. So things in our peripheral vision, particularly in the upper temporal lobe, cause an emotional jolt. And that's when we think that we've seen something out of the corner of our eye, something alarming and all this. This is why Google Glass was such a failure. It was brilliant technology, but horrid psychology, because they put this picture in these eyeglasses in your upper temporal field, which is where you're most distractible and emotionally ignitable. And so people revolted against this.
Wow. So, I'm a parent. I've got a younger child. What advice would you give parents of children to? Do you say go cold turkey? Do you say limit screen time? How do we talk to kids and get them to deal with this?
The advice of the American Pediatric Society and me is no screens before the age of 6. There's no reason they have to have them. If you must look at it, like you say, you're going to FaceTime with grandma or grandpa, then you do it together with your child. Okay. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, give them the regular toys that you play the games with them that you played as a child. The most important thing is to engage with them one-on-one in a humanistic way. Mm-hmm. To an infant, there is nothing more fascinating than another human face. They lock onto it. Their pupils dilate. They follow it around. And when you take an iPad and hang it over a bassinet or put it in the iPod trainer or otherwise shove it in front of their face, you're blocking the developing central vision of a young child. And to me, that's a form of child abuse because screens don't talk with a person the way that the parent or the grandparent does, or even the babysitter does. They talk with the child. Screens talk at them, and they don't engage them on a social level. So that would be my advice, is just no screens at all. Forget it.
I understand what you're saying. I also worry a little bit about the advent of artificial intelligence getting good enough to do that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, artificial intelligence, most people don't realize that artificial intelligence has been around a long time, certainly in medicine and pharmacology and in manufacture. Mm-hmm. But, now we have things like ChatGPT and the programs that make drawings and all that. So we'll have to see how they come along. But, when steam engine trains could go 30 miles an hour, people threw up their hands and said, "Oh my God, the human body was not meant to go so fast." Well, we adapted, and we had jet planes and going 600 miles an hour. But I think we may have reached the point where the technology is simply overwhelms what our brain's able to do. I mean, most people don't realize that we have a fixed energy limit, a fixed bandwidth of energy available, and no amount of diet, exercise, supplements, or Sudoku puzzles is going to ever be able to increase this. And so we're asking it, by piling all this stuff on like an avalanche, we're asking it to do far more than it's able to do. So in terms of multitasking, which is a fool's errand, do one thing at a time. You'll be much more productive and efficient if you take one thing and finish it and then move on to the next, rather than trying to do 5 things at once that are half-assed and never finished.
Sure. Now, you've given some advice as to when to allow children access to these devices. What about older children and like teenagers? What should we be advising them? Obviously, you've talked to us about some of the bad impacts of this on girls, on body image and bulimia and this. How do we help teenagers? Do we tell them, what should we tell them?
One thing you just mentioned there is comparison, is that what these devices do. You're looking at TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and so you're comparing yourself against 7 billion people on the planet, the most gorgeous, talented, etc. And so comparison is the basis of all emotion. And the best way to compare is not to compare yourself up. Oh, look how rich they are. Look how successful they are. Look at what they have and I don't have, because you just make yourself feel bad. And compare yourself downward and say, well, this isn't so bad. Look at what I have. I'm pretty lucky. I've got a roof over my head. I've got food to eat. Mm-hmm. What do I have to complain about?
So be aware of what you should be thankful for.
I think so. One, the notion of gratitude, and realize that if you start to compare yourself against all these people online, you can never win. And so to realize that the only strategy is not to play that game. And if you convince teenagers to not play that game, because they put themselves in a situation where they can never win, then they'll be better off. So, to quote Nancy Reagan, just say no. So you have to learn how to say no to these devices. Yes. And to what everybody else is doing. Just because everybody else is on TikTok and Instagram and all that, do you really need to go there? Is this just a mob mentality that you're following? What about your own thinking? What about your own individual personality? Mm-hmm. And I think it helps. I mean, as a parent, it would help a teenager to help them develop their individual identity and to understand what their strengths are and to play to that. Mm-hmm. And to be secure and happy without having to go outside and try to strive for things that they're not going to be able to achieve because you're asking for the impossible.
That's good advice to maintain mental health, to not be comparing yourself all the time against the prime good-looking rich people. Mental health is definitely a huge issue.
Do you think those prime good-looking rich people are really happy? I doubt that they are, because by definition, ambitious people like that who get rich, etc., they are never satisfied because they are ambitious. And so they're always comparing themselves to people who are even richer or better looking, etc. You don't realize what actors and models go through. I remember Richard Madden, the British actor. He said, "My God," he said, men have to go through what women went through decades ago. I can't even eat. I'm starving myself because they expect me to be buff and ripped and have a six-pack abdomen. And if I don't do that, then I have no career." So here's somebody who's so successful, so wealthy from his work, and he's miserable because he's being held to this incredibly high standard. So don't be misled by thinking that all these fabulous people are really happy and better off than you. They're not. They're even more miserable than you are. Yeah. So just drop the misery.
One thing that we noticed in terms of the smartphones and the social media, it's all passive mostly. Most of the time is passive entertainment. You're not actively doing anything. So, for our kids, we basically said, well, you have some allotment of time that you can use on the phone, but we want to make sure that you have time for creativity. So you have to have, creative time as well, where you are creating things, and it doesn't matter what it is. You could be practicing your piano, you could be drawing, you could be building Legos, but to ensure that you have that time available to you to do something creative and contribute a little bit.
And doing things like that is what builds resilience in people. And resilience is the ability to withstand all the pressures on us. So if you practice the piano and you get a piece down and you can play it for other people to enjoy, then pat yourself on the back and say, "Hey, I did this. Look at this. Wow, look what I accomplished." We have come to identify screens with pleasure, and it's usurped the kind of pleasure of, look what I can do on the piano. Look what I can do in my drawing. Look what I can do in my dance or with my baseball team or whatever it might be. And so I think parents should reinforce to their children, when they do have these kinds of successes, of what a success that is. And I mentor medical students at UW University. And one of the topics that we talk about all the time is resilience. You're going to have things where you're rejected, where things are bad, etc. And how are you going to cope with that? Are you going to fall apart and have a mental breakdown? Or are you going to be able to pull yourself through it? And the more you're able to do things, then let's say you get through a bad time. Okay, you get a bad evaluation, or a teacher says something critical of you, and you feel embarrassed by it in front of other people. Well, let's say that you get through it. So the next time that happens, you're going to say, "Oh, I've seen this before. This is familiar. I can handle this." And that's how resilience comes along. I mean, I've had incredible heartbreaks and losses, and I've had incredible wins and successes. And of course, you can't know the good and the pleasurable without knowing the bad. I mean, it's like a yin and yang. You can't have an upstate and a downstate with nothing in between. That's how we understand things in terms of opposites like this.
You mention in your book that there's some controversy amongst experts regarding smartphone disorder. Could you discuss why you think that is?
I'm not sure what you mean by smartphone disorder.
You say that many experts are resistant to acknowledging that there's
it's the resistance is between people who are saying, these devices could really be harmful, versus the tech enthusiasts who said, "Oh no, this is an unalloyed good. This is the best thing that's ever happened. You're just being alarmist in this game." Well, the problem is that they talk about they misunderstand the precautionary principle, and they're saying, "Well, we need more information. We need more evidence that these are harmful." Well, the problem is that this is such a messy area to deal in. There are so many variables involved that if we ever could study this in the way that the critics want, we'll be forever in getting that kind of thing. So right now, the people who invoke the precautionary principle are, if this could be damaging and harmful, then why not stop it now? Why just agree that? Why not? Why ignore it and say, "Oh no, this is fabulous"? And so that's the controversy between the people who refuse to acknowledge that there could be any harm whatsoever, versus those that say, "Wait a minute, I'm seeing my child is berserk with their phone. They won't look at me. They won't talk to me. I get a grunt from them if I ask them a question. I'm seeing it in front of my own eyes that these devices are really screwing my kid up."
So do you advise that people should just avoid it, or are you more for a balanced approach?
There's no avoiding it. I think it's here to stay, but we have to learn how to live with it. And so the first is taking a defensive posture of saying, I know what these companies are doing to me. I know what these devices want to do to me. Am I going to let it do that? How am I going to push back? In what way am I going to say no to it? How am I going to configure breaks into my routine where I put the device down or leave it behind and go outside for a walk? I mean, one of the best antidotes to the screen is to go outside in nature, walk around the block. It doesn't take being in the woods. Although, of course, when you're in the woods, you're getting all these phytochemicals that are being released by plants that you're not consciously aware of how they're affecting you. But nature is restorative. In the woods, on the beach, you name it. You don't. But even if you're in a busy city, just a little park where there's a single tree is enough to be in green space. Many famous people were great walkers. Nietzsche was one. He said all great ideas are born during walking. Virginia Woolf is another one where she got all her characters and plots when she went on long walks in the countryside. She would say, she said, all this, it was like bubbles blowing out of a pipe. And who blew the bubbles? I don't know, but there the ideas were. So I think when you can sort of put the brain on hold by going out in nature, it's really an antidote to screens. I do something, and I admit it. I meditate. I do what's called Soto Zen. Soto Zen is serene reflection meditation, and unlike the Theravada Zen, which involves koans, two hands brought together make a sound. What's the sound of one hand clapping? Well, for me, that's death. Because my brain would be so in overdrive, I couldn't do that. So serene reflection is just looking at a blank wall of the floor, eyes open, because if you close your eyes, you're going to daydream, and you try neither to think nor not to think. Just sitting is the essence of Soto Zen. And it's very, very refreshing. Now, sometimes when I'm working on an area of writing, I will cheat, and I confess that I shouldn't do this, but I do. I'll put a little legal pad by my side with a pen, and I'm there sitting, looking at the wall, and lo and behold, a thought comes to me out of nowhere, and it's like, that's related to the problem that I'm working on, okay? Because I'm not thinking about it, so the answer comes up. And I thought, wow, and I'll just jot down a word or two about to remind me that, okay, I'm thinking about it, and I'll go back. And so that might happen a time, maybe it happened just once or a couple times during meditation. So when we can quiet the mind and not have all this busyness in our head, which is what the phone and the screen does, then it's better for our health. This is why I say the best thing anybody can do is go to bed.
Okay.
Get a good night's sleep. Get a good night's sleep, and you're gonna be functioning so much better and be so much more productive. And as I tell the first day with a new group of students, I get a little PowerPoint presentation showing the architecture of sleep. And I said, if you early on in the evening, we go to stage 1, 2, 3, 4, REM sleep, back down to the deeper stages of sleep. The deep stages of sleep, which is the most restful and where memory consolidation happens, occurs in the early part of the night. So if you stay up late to cram, you're jettisoning all that. So it's far better if you've got to do a presentation or want to study, go to bed at a regular time every night and set an alarm clock to wake you up at 4 or 5 a.m. and do your cramming then early in the morning.
Oh, interesting.
And you're going to function much better. Trust me. Scout's honor.
And it's much better to be refreshed and able to respond to challenges, I think, than being tired as well. That's when you make mistakes, I think.
Well, we are a wired and tired nation. Everybody stays awake too late.
Well, thank you very much, Richard Cytowic, for your information on your Stone Age brain in the screen age. Appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about it. It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.